What if the public sector isn't behind the curve, but ahead of it when it comes to managing complexity? This episode reveals why government and healthcare transformations might hold the keys to your business success.
Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here today. We have a very international episode because I'm recording from location and I'm talking to a guest based in the UK. I always love bringing you stories from elsewhere. Today, we are going to talk about what does chaos and being stuck and or having pivoted or changed or grown too fast look like in a different industry, namely in the space between government and public services. My guest today is Vijay Luthra. And he does kind of similar stuff that I do, but for a different market. We're going to hear all about it. He has a background as a civil servant and then spent ample time with some of the major consulting houses, is now going it alone, and is a specialist in human-centered transformations. He talks about helping teams and organizations get unstuck after they've maybe been through a change journey or otherwise have had some upheaval and somehow at the end of that are not quite where they need to be. So sounds like stuff we talk about here all the time. Thank you so much for joining me today, Vijay.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about chaos in government and public services.
Lovely. As an outsider, it always looks that there is indeed ample chaos there. So very interested to hear a little bit more from you. What does chaos in your industry look like, or what do those stuck situations look like? Where do you come in, and how does that maybe relate to more the business to business space where I'm in?
Yeah, well, I mean, my starting point is usually to sort of set out that in my view we exist in this time of complexity. What you might hear some people refer to as a polycrisis or a meta crisis. And what that means is we've got a sort of series of meta or global challenges all converging at the same time. So, for example, climate change. For example, not everywhere, but in many parts of the world, an aging population. For example, we have the threat of war, or not even just the threat of war in Europe. We have the first conflict in mainland Europe since the end of the Second World War. So we're existing in this very volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment at the moment, and that's coupled with sort of a set of other challenges. So economically, the UK, like many countries, is not as doing as well as it used to. There's probably still a lot of fallout from the financial crisis of 2008, but in the UK we also had Brexit, and that's created a really very significant impact on our economy. And so, like the people you work with in the private sector, government and public services are having to grapple with the impact of all of those challenges. I think it makes for a more challenging environment than it's ever been. I tend to take the view that this is the most volatile the world has been since the end of the Second World War, and then you couple that with the massive changes that we're seeing socially, culturally, and from a technology perspective. So I've coined the term for this. I call it the fifth industrial revolution. And I think the interesting thing about this industrial revolution, is that it's probably different to the other industrial revolutions that have come before, partly because during those other industrial revolutions, we saw more opportunity created from those revolutions. I think this technological revolution may not create as much opportunity as previous waves of technological revolution have.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? But why? Because the change is faster than ever, right? And there is, the pace of which innovation is happening has never been greater. Yet, so that seems to somewhat be at odds with the idea that the opportunity is reduced.
Yeah, well, I think maybe I should caveat that by saying that the opportunity for some is greater, but I think the opportunity for the majority is potentially a lot less. I mean, if you look at the sort of employment landscape as we sort of look into the future, there are potentially some very significant challenges around where a lot of those jobs of the future come from. For example, we can look at large chunks of the creative industries. You already have relatively basic large language models that from a typed prompt can produce quite sophisticated, and to all intents and purposes, footage that can't be differentiated from relatively high quality footage that's been produced by human actors with a camera. So I think that's one area of challenge. In government and public services, we look at areas, for example, that are perhaps a bit more transactional, and it's very clear to me that in the next 10 to 20 years, those areas will be disrupted very, very significantly, and that for many, perhaps that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the sort of the downside of implementing technology at scale is that where we have, for example, significant employment opportunities, perhaps in the back or middle office of government departments. So the example in the UK would be the Department for Work and Pensions, which handles our social protection. So it's benefits, it's our state pension, disability payments, all of those kind of things. And the DWP is well known for employing very significant numbers of people, because a lot of its processes are still quite manual, quite analog.
What does DWP stand for?
The Department for Work and Pensions.
Okay.
And so the Department for Work and Pensions has this reputation for being quite sort of still human based. And if sort of over the next decade or so we automate more of that, where do all of those jobs go? Because a lot of those jobs are in areas where it's post-industrial communities where coal mines or steel working or sort of those manufacturing industries used to be. So you've taken those jobs, those manufacturing jobs have gone away, and then you've replaced them with these kind of sort of transactional processing type jobs. But then if those go, what is left for those people? So I think there are some very, very significant challenges that we have to navigate.
Yeah, and business needs to happen much less local than it used to, right? So can we talk a little bit more about the people dynamics? 'Cause you talk about people-centered transformations. You work in a space where you're working with two types of organizations that are used to working together, yet are culturally quite different, right? So when you come in, typically things are not in a great state because something's happened or something's not working. What is some of the what is it that is affecting people, that has affected people most typically in the lead up to those situations? So apart from there being, of course, a lot of upheaval, what are some of the things or the biggest disconnects that you run into in your space?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a range of factors. So very often we see disillusionment among government and public sector workforces. So we're doing a lot of work in the National Health Service at the moment, and the NHS is undergoing a very significant wave of reform in the UK, the biggest for sort of 20 years or so, and that's partly driven by the sort of existential threat that that the NHS is facing. It's, under this incredible burden from our aging population, but it's also under an incredible burden from very significant levels of metabolic disease, so type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular heart disease as examples. So reform needs to happen, but healthcare, whatever kind of healthcare system you exist in, healthcare is more or less, to a very large extent, anywhere you go, still a service provided by people to other people, and there are some very significant opportunities to make healthcare more effective, more efficient by deploying technology. But at the end of the day, I think for a very long time to come, as opposed to some other parts of government and public services, I think healthcare will remain very much a human-to-human area of delivery. And I think the challenge for that is that where you are trying to change, you need to bring the people along with you. I don't think that's a particularly sophisticated revolution, sophisticated insights. We all know that, right? But I think what we often underestimate is the complexity of bringing people with us along on the journey, or along with us on the journey. I think the other challenge is that we, certainly in the UK, we often look at these reform and transformation opportunities as a way to reduce cost. My argument generally tends to be that's a rather reductionist paradigm to be applying to these kind of opportunities. I would argue that human-centered reform, human-centered transformation is actually about looking at how do we make these things better for not just the people who need these services, but also the people who are responsible for delivering them. So again, in healthcare, it's often presented as a binary choice. You can either make it better for patients, or you can either make it better for clinicians. We shouldn't have to make those choices. We can make things better for both patients and clinicians and the administrators. In fact, we can make it better for all of the people involved in that process.
Yeah.
But my note of caution is always never start from a position of we need to save X amount of money. The starting point should be, how do we make it better? And then one of the outcomes you might seek from that is to gain more efficiency in the system. But with most of these services, we're looking at long-term outcomes. So healthcare, for example, the financial benefit might not accrue for 5 or 10 years. And really we ought to be looking at public services through those kind of lenses, rather than saying we need to salami slice everything to be able to save X amount of money, this financial year.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, right? Because on many change initiatives, there's a dollar amount attached to it, and if initiative is coined initially by just that is almost impossible to shed. And in reality, it's not about that, right? Because if you're running a business or an organization and you cut a quarter of your budget, but it also means you can no longer do what you're supposed to do. It's there is always a cut a budget, and the number is coming from this, and it's based on something and not communicating the other variables that are in that mix is such detrimental. And if you start with that, it's kind of, I find it typically a very hard recovery. And I do recognize the conversations of coming in and saying, well, how do you bring people in? And some of the first conversations are about, listen, ultimately, if we keep an organization going here where there's 20% of the jobs that are so tedious and so repetitive and so uninteresting, but we keep them to keep people employed, you have a 20% workforce who's going to, maybe apart from the random 1 or 2%, going to hate their job on a daily basis. How is that going to affect you, culture? Who's going to do those jobs? So ultimately, keeping something around for the sake of keeping it around when it's really not healthy. There's sometimes some tough choices that need to be made, right?
Yes.
Creating jobs that nobody wants to do or that don't need doing has seldom made anybody happier.
No, that's true. I would argue, going back to my example earlier, in some of those post-industrial areas, we have created, sort of transactional roles, which are necessary. They're necessary right now because of the way we do things. So, you therefore need 200 people sat in a call center, or you need 500 people processing a particular type of application. But, technology will change all that in due course. And so, the question then becomes, fine, you can move those people on. But if you're a government or a public sector organization, my view is your job is also to think about what do we move those people onto. And, I don't want to get too political, but, this is bound up in the challenges that we're seeing across the globe with populism, for example. People are feeling very vulnerable. They're feeling, dare I say it, exploited. And, I think that is manifesting itself in some rather volatile politics in the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit maybe then specifically about the technology, because what I'm hearing you say, and I'm inferring a little, but what I'm hearing you say is something that I see on technology deployment in business too, that there is this initiative teed off to implement technology. And because the conversation is not so simple with the employees who currently do that work because they're afraid of their job, right? And because the project might have been teed up not in the most effective manner. Too often then these technology projects are developed in isolation with a specialist systems consultant and two senior people who do not know the nitty-gritty of the process. And so the product ultimately doesn't function, or the system or the setup doesn't function. So from where do you sit? How do we get better at doing this technology deployment and actually bringing the people who currently do some of that work in? And how can we do that in a way that it actually helps to create a picture as to where people still are the value adds and how we could then transform their current roles?
Yeah. Well, so I generally say to my clients, don't do technology transformation at all until you are ready for it. And how do you get ready for it? Well, you optimize your processes, you prepare your workforce, you make sure that they have the right capability and they also have the capacity. And if you have, if there are skills that you need which you don't have in the workforce, then you need to go out and buy those skills, or retrain, your existing workforce. So I sense there's a great deal of pressure to quickly adopt new technologies. We're caught in a sort of hype cycle, particularly around AI at the moment. And we as a business, we experiment with AI. Both my business partner and I, we use Copilot, for example, and we use other tools to support us. But I guess in a very controlled way, and having undertaken some training to understand how to make the best use of those tools. My view is AI, as with any type of software, or any type of technology, hardware included, if you rush to implement it without really understanding what other dependencies there are across the organization, you are doomed to fail. And certainly, so a number of years ago, I worked on on the face of it, what was a relatively simple program to implement a new ERP system into a very large government organization in the UK, and it had gone wrong. And the principal reason it had gone wrong was because the finance function hadn't been prepared well enough to work with this new system, and so it all became this very large and complex program became derailed. And this was nearly a decade ago now, and when I reflect on it, I don't see these problems becoming any less, which shows me that we're still making the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah. So that makes me think of a statistic that I just referred to in something else last week. There is somewhere in the range of 85 to 95% of businesses say that they're looking at AI. I was talking about AI FOMO and feeling that you need to do more than you're doing. But it turns out that 85 to 95% or so of businesses, both in Europe and the US, say that they're doing something, right? And they're implementing something. But there's less than 5% who actually can really report that they've really made any transformation of any business processes in their businesses using AI. So in reality then is that it's this looming thing, right? It's declared we're doing this, but nothing's really happening. And I would imagine that change projects typically last too long. And, but in your world, things already move at a slower pace typically than in business anyway. Can we talk a little bit about what does it do to people to have these looming changes or looming projects that actually don't really happen or don't take hold? And how does it affect your culture and maybe even lead to getting stuck in its own right before you've even done anything?
Yeah. Well, I would say, firstly, it's a big emotional burden for a workforce to have to carry, and it's very difficult to do transformation and maintain psychological safety. And I would reflect that there are a lot of public services organisations which are not necessarily renowned for having good psychological safety in the first place. I think it's becoming a lot better because leadership in government and public services has become much more sophisticated. So there's a broader understanding of the necessity for good culture and psychological safety and role modeling the right behaviors. But yeah, I mean, if you're undergoing transformation, it can sometimes bring out the worst in people. And, as you note, some of that is rational human behavior. In the face of a threat, we respond in a particular way. So that's why we talk about human-centered transformation, because the first and last place you need to be in order to succeed is alongside the humans, understanding what their needs are. We're not yet at a point where we can dispense with the human completely. So at least for the time being, you've got to bring your workforce on the journey. That's not easy. It's complex. I talk to clients a lot about what are the psychology challenges that we need to navigate as we move through a reform or transformation program. And often it actually isn't just the workforce for public services. We're also thinking about, the users of those public services. So if I go back to health, for example, we've got some very significant behavioral challenges to navigate in order to, help make a sustainable future for our health services. We need to encourage people to eat differently and exercise more. And how do we build all that into programs of public service reform? And then again, in other areas, in social protection and welfare, for example, we need to incentivize people in those spaces to operate a bit differently. We also work in education. One of the things, we're running a project at the moment to look at, how do you sort of influence teachers to do things slightly differently. And one of the things that we're looking at as a dimension of that is the sort of regime around measurement of performance in education in the UK. So, that human element is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it's the mental capacity, right? There is this balance because people suffer from change overload both in personal lives and in life in general and at work, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. And yes, I hear leaders say, well, but people want to know what's coming, but telling them what's coming and then not doing anything about it and having it hang there, that takes up capacity. That already contributes to that sense of overload before anything's happened, right? So there is some kind of healthy level between everybody needing to know everything and actually being busy with what's current and today, and having that focus.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that analysis. I mean, I talk to our clients about the need to spin two plates. One is a run the business or run the organization plate. The other is a change the business plate. And you've got to be ambidextrous, because you've got to be able to do both of those things at once. It's not really optional to do them
one at the expense of the other.
Yeah, one after the other. And the other thing I would note is it's the world we're in. We are now likely in a world where the need for change will be constant. So it won't just be one and done. It'll be a constantly shifting external environment that requires us to be constantly, if not undertaking major change, at least tweaking things.
Yeah, and hence this podcast, and hence the business space we're in, right? Helping businesses. Well, we're at the business end of things, but helping organizations and teams understand how to navigate turmoil, because turmoil is here to stay. And if you have the right toolkit, then you can ride that wave with then it feels maybe more like surfing than being sloshed around. So trying to bring things back to on a final positive note, Vijay, if you look at because you've been also with some of the major consulting houses, and although you've been in that space of businesses, I assume you've also seen some over the fence. So looking at your type of industries and organizations, what is it that business leaders can maybe learn from your type of clients about transformations? What is something that happens on your side of the fence that is probably that those organizations are probably better at than the average business organization and could benefit from going forward in this fifth industrial revolution?
Yeah, I think public services organizations are really good at dealing with complexity. So they don't have the luxury of that some private sector organizations do, of being able to say, we are not going to serve this particular client segment, or we're not going to address this market. Government and public services by its nature needs to be for everyone. And so, the edge cases, as you might call them, are, often bread and butter for government. So I think there are some really outstanding examples. One I would point to would be in the UK, .gov.uk, which is our sort of national government website. It's where you go for everything. And that I think is a best-in-class example of how you create a resource that is accessible to the broadest range of people possible. I mean, it's a really to look at it, it looks very simple, but that is the point: is that it's simple and yet accessible. So that's a really good example. And then I think there's some really interesting and emergent thinking around how the UK is creating what it calls a digital centre of government. And so I think for organisations in your sector, there is, going back to this metaphor of the need to spin two plates, a run the business plate and a change the business plate. I would be thinking about, how do you create a strategic digital center within your business, and that strategic digital center needs to be across both of those domains. It needs to understand what are the needs of run the business, but also what are the needs of change the business, and that it should be influencing into leadership.
Yeah, well, I love that, because I talk lots about decision making, and if you have more must-dos, that actually makes the decision making already more complex, typically, right? But the whole tool around good decision making is that if you practice that more in that kind of a setup, you also get better at it. So I actually love your example, because it does mean that looking at the deployment of decision-making frameworks, or how decisions are made in your types of industries and organizations, indeed would be a good example or offer some great case studies that might be relevant for business. So thank you for that. I also loved you bringing up polycrisis. I often talk about all these interdependencies that the World Economic Forum is also indicating, right? That everything is becoming infinitely more interdependent. We talk about it being a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world out there. And that's for everybody, because that's also where you started. You also talked about the binary choices and that are sometimes there, and the long term, that you guys are so much more focused on long term outcomes than maybe in business, but that ultimately the people dynamics are not necessarily very different, and that even if you are in a very people centered industry, that the individual fears of employees in your organization are not any different just because they are maybe more used to working in a people-centered design. So I think we could talk for long more to come, but that's not what fits in an episode. So after hearing you here, if people want to reach out, know more about you or what you do or your business, where do they go? What do they do?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. So Vijay K Luthra is my LinkedIn URL. Or you can find our company, Ceva, CEVA, at www.cevaglobal.co. And you'll find phone numbers and emails on the website. Perfect.
Well, we will also put all of that in the show notes. Thank you for being my guest today, Vijay. Thank you to all the listeners for tuning in. I'm glad you are here, and I hope you found some inspiration to have a look around in some other industries and how they're doing things, because the chaos is everywhere, and whatever we can add to our toolkit to deal with this turmoil on a daily basis is, of course, of benefits to get better, right? So thank you, Vijay.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.